I don't make mistakes. I'm not just like the rest of you. I'm stronger. I'm smarter. I'm better. I am better.
The world of comics owes Pat Mills a massive debt of gratitude, not just simply for being Pat, but I think mainly for his contributions as a comic editor, writer and overseer. Mills's place in history will be secured as a matter of course, as an influential figure through his efforts in inspiring and promoting a generation of British comic artists and writers who effectively went on to change the face of comics and latterly film for good. As titles such as 2000 AD, Action, Charlie's War and Crisis, all of these are key points within a varied and illustrious career that mark him out as one of the UK comic industry's most valuable contributors. The panel submitted for analysis here comes from his acclaimed series Marshal Law, in this case from the first series that came out titled Fear and Loathing. This is the late 1980s text that could be described today as revisionist, in that it sets about breaking down the myths and certainties surrounding established iconography, and it offers a new, revised way of understanding and enjoying what previously seemed to be a fixed narrative. One could also make the case that Marshal Law was part of a larger, cross-medium 1980s cultural impulse, in a not too dissimilar fashion to the likes of David Lynch, John Waters and many artists from that time. The book revisits ideas that have underpinned post-war American popular culture. Remember, these creatives were people brought up, immersed in the cultural noise of 1950s Americana.
What's wrong with her? She's a woman, isn't she?
What separated them from most was a sense of ironic, observational detachment. These were post-countercultural artists who recognised the darker, troubling subcurrents that ran beneath consensual mainstream culture and who fully understood that these sub-narratives had been underexplored.
This passivity may result in homosexuality in order to neutralise or ward off this fantasied, threatening image of the father.
Mill's graphic story continues this type of investigative thread, in that it pushes past the shiny surfaces of white authoritarian ideals of morality and heroism and inverts them, shining a new light from a different angle on what were and still are very familiar elements. Consistently angry, political and driven, I have to say Mills's position has also resonated with me personally as a working class boy living in Portsmouth. I'd made it through the Thatcher years, but like many of my generation, I'd grown up being swamped in the 1960s and 70s by American cultural products, from books, television, films and yes, comics, consuming it all with a mixture of awe, obsession and yet simultaneously an ironic detachment.
Funny, isn't it, how people can have such a different memory of the exact same thing. It's all a matter of perspective, I guess.
Mill's coruscating graphic series Marshal Law expressed an open contempt for the superhero's existence as a construct in pretty clear terms, as he casts his heroes as contemporary deities who are at root anti-democratic, arrogant, distant. These costume beings act as the very epitome of unchecked, entitled authority, as he makes a case against valorization of the superhero as an ideal. Mills has always produced politicized work, sometimes very explicitly, sometimes working at a more subtextual level. But here it feels like the condemnation is readily apparent. Certainly this invective is at its most compelling in that first run of Marshal Law books. Mills and his artist Kevin O'Neill, who was responsible for great work on ABC Warriors, Nemesis and the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, elaborate on the premise that an image of unchallenged heroism and an aspiration to a prominent social status, more often than not, are cover for a more sinister story of repression, control, and deceit. As often the bad guys can seem very attractive, they can be seductive, they can inspire us, resulting in us aspiring to be like them. But these heroes often come cloaked in smiles and with life-affirming promises. And for Mills, costumed heroes are absolutely the worst of the bunch, especially when they pretend to be the good guys.
I am uniquely qualified to write a negative view of superheroes, and I cannot think of anyone else who could trump me in that respect, because it goes right to the bone.
As he states in his excellent book, Be Pure, Be Vigilant, Behave, his dislike of most superheroes is evidence of this position. As he goes on to say, they are inevitably upper middle class, arms dealers, tycoons, lawyers, scientists and so forth with establishment values. And they offer no questioning of the status quo in any real or meaningful way. And they feature men we're supposed to look up to rather than identify with. Those wretched corporate gods. For me, they're more than just vacuous posers, more than just harmless entertainment not to be taken too seriously. They are the acknowledged icons of America. Their superpowers are a symbol of the country's super technology. Martial law conjoins the superhero with connotations of fascism, hedonism, materialism, vigilantism, unchecked power, and a fixed, immovable social hierarchy, where personal responsibility is something only practiced by the weakest. Superheroism is also, as Mills posits, stagnation, the end of culture, an empty cul-de-sac in evolutionary and progressive terms. Although you can easily set martial law's thematic as an extension of the restless, rebellious and political challenge that underpins Mills' own character, comics are undoubtedly a collaborative medium. Kevin O'Neill's presence as artist is all important here, and martial law is evidence for just how vital a part of the creative process this relationship is.
I think Kevin came up with this great-looking character, and the name as well. That came from Kevin too. So he was a name and a character in search of a story.
Mills himself qualifies this when he discusses the inspirational nature of the artist's contributions towards his own written pieces, certainly in terms of tone and approach. As he says, on most stories I respond to the artist's vision. I've gained enormously from responding to Kevin O'Neill's vision on Nemesis and Martial Law. Here suggesting a symbiotic approach that serves the unique aesthetic found here and the sense of a balanced creative enterprise. The idea of the 1980s making sense of the 1950s resonates here quite profoundly. His creation, Colonel Buck Kane, and his alter ego, the Public Spirit, is another of the many Superman pastiches, tributes and critiques that sprang up for this intensely deconstructive era within comic production. As the British creatives divorced from the social, cultural and political contexts of America itself, consumed these ideas second-hand. All of them that emerged through this period seem to embody a kind of push-pull impulse. They all undoubtedly love the craft and the energy of American comics, yet they tempered this with an innate suspiciousness of the American imperialist project that comes as attached, embedded. The deconstructive British artists and writers such as Mark Millar, Gareth Ennis, Grant Morrison, Peter Mulligan, and of course Alan Moore, to name but a few, seemingly express a desire to follow the concept of the superpowered being to its natural conclusions. Pat Mills's Public Spirit is aloof and godlike, and it extends from this deeply embedded cultural archetype of the Golden Age Siegel and Shuster's version of Superman, which was founded during the self-help Depression-era politics of the late 1930s. Most of their experiences of this character were of the later paternalistic version that by the 1950s had settled into a complacent symbol of cultural power and abundance that typified America at that point. This is nothing new, after all. With something so embedded within popular culture, it is inevitable that there will be commonplace parodies of such a well-known idea. From the 1940s onwards, various versions, knockoffs, send-ups, satires, and comedic or political comments on Superman and the values he represents have littered our now global cross-media landscape. The 1980s saw a raft of celebrations, pastiches, critiques and interrogations of this ideal on both sides of the Atlantic. And the public spirit is set into a rich lineage from this period, which also includes Marvel's Hyperion, to more savage British takedowns, such as Alan Moore's pioneering Miracle Man revival in 1982, which was based on the 1950s UK character, which in turn was swiped from Fawcett's 1940s Captain Marvel. And incarnated in his Doc Manhattan figure from The Watchmen. This revisionary impulse also brought Frank Miller's demolition of Kal-El himself in The Dark Knight Returns. And we can add to this other variants such as Grant Morrison's Zenith, for example, along with many, many others. Serving a range of agendas, this faux Superman figure was a useful mechanism, one more than capable of bearing the weight of some sobering, broad-ranging analysis. For example, from Alan Moore's own Supreme in 1996, where he seems to come to the end of this cycle and the superhero appears seemingly trapped in amber as an unashamedly nostalgic narrative, reinforcing the backward-looking reactionary nature of the idea. It also served as a rejection of what Moore felt was an inappropriate dramatic weight that was being loaded onto the 1980s superhero in the wake of his own Watchmen. This analysis can also extend to a more playful critique of the heteronormative conventions that have defined Superman since the character's inception. This is essayed in the provocative Apollo character and is detailed by both Warren Ellis and Mark Millar in the DC comic The Authority. But that more Millsian disgust of self-appointed authority figures still reappears from time to time within the next generation of revisionary contemporary narratives, such as Warren Ellis's Black Summer and No Hero, along with Garth Ennis's The Boys, which of course now has gone on to have a cultural life of its own. To me, Mills's work stands out here and is pivotal, undoubtedly building on the freedoms afforded by the success of Watchmen as a publishing phenomenon. He took the all-pervasive, morally impeccable archetype and repositioned this super protector into a much darker and more subversive perspective, one that tapped into a psychosexual narrative that truly got under the skin of the construct. Here, Kane is the public spirit. He's the head of a pantheon of religious, right-wing superhero gods who are under suspicion of being connected to a series of crimes by the arguably equally disturbed and disturbing government enforcer Marshal Law. Fan dissections of the 1980s period played around the concept of the alien being that is Superman wears a human face to pass among us, positing that Clark Kent is in effect a mask and not a character. The charade of the secret identity is therefore shown as a necessary lie to allow him to continue his role as the guardian of Earth. Mills takes that conceit a stage further, and he states that the very nature of the superbeing, who grandly claims to be a purveyor of truth, is fundamentally informed by a contradictory, foundational lie. Mills and O'Neill extend this further into a today commonplace statement, in that these type of costumed adventurers need to embrace such a fallacy because they habitually present more than one personality as part of their psychological makeup. This is territory that has been mined by Moore, but in Marshal Law this idea goes further and insinuates this into a broader socio-political discourse. The character's name in itself, of course, is a slick pun on the ideals of citizenship that sit central to the American superhero and are here corrupted by Kane. Mills notes here that psychopathy relies on a presentation of different personality surfaces to serve the aims of the protagonist within different settings. The pitch throughout the comic is appropriately often hysterical, abrasive and sometimes downright disturbing, but this seems to complement Mills's agenda entirely. There is an aesthetic that runs through of barely suppressed and sometimes physically manifested rage that underpins the core idea that if your moral code is so highly constricted to appear as rigid and immovable and contained within such polarities of good and evil, then surely you have to be hiding something. Separation is not cast as an exemplar of goodness and self-sacrifice here, but more as an illness and as a sign of incompleteness and of the disconnection from humanity that Kane and his kind represent. Marshal Law is still one of the most startling books of its particular era, and it's a beautifully sick, cynical and bitter story but unpicks the fetishism and narcissism that lurks within those who need to hide behind costumes and would seek to impose from above without accountability. It warns of the proselytizing of a fascistic social and aesthetic order that is based on a celebration of power as aligned to simplistic understandings of physical beauty and strength. It is a challenging read on all sorts of levels, and the uncompromising style of the book itself is intrinsic to serving the narrative's agenda. Mills and O'Neill unleash a tale here that functions somewhat like a Stanley Kubrick superhero sequel to Clockwork Orange.
Pretty well, little brother. Pretty well.
The book seems to be hewn from that same stark, highly theatrical, corrosive material that burns into your brain in a similar, indelible manner to Kubrick's iconic Tableau. You can almost taste the acid cynicism just looking at O'Neill's exemplary artwork alone, even when divorced from the dialogue. According to Wikipedia, unsourced notably, there were complaints to the publishers, Epic, about the nature of the artwork, which maybe highlights the singular nature of O'Neill's work here. American audiences perhaps weren't so keen on the very impressionistic and wild, raw, angry work of O'Neill. As Pat Mills stated in an interview for The Times in July 2009, never ask the readers what they want in this business, because they always ask for the same things: superheroes and future wars. But what they really want is what they've not been given. Well, the public got both here, perhaps not quite the way that they thought. O'Neill's distinctive, angular, blocky aesthetic seems entirely appropriate as the way to illustrate a dysfunctional world, frighteningly out of kilter. There's a sense of wrongness here that he taps into that goes well beyond literal storytelling. O'Neill deliberately subverts the general trends within mainstream commercial comic art, which do tend towards an artistic rationalism. Yet his work here manages to be pointing towards two different traditions. It is oddly prescient in its prediction of the kind of ridiculous, amazingly non-satirical aesthetics that dominated the 1990s to come, as perpetuated by the likes of Rob Liefeld et al. Here that extension into a kind of physical impressionism can be seen to fulfill a very different agenda. That parade of grotesque barrel chests, cannon-like arms, all forged from steroid-enhanced rock, the draping of impossible women across them, balancing ludicrous memories and somehow managing to exist with ridiculously hyper-thin waists, centralised some of the ugliest work in mainstream comics through that particular time, as heroes were made to look less like human beings and more like a sugar-hyped collage of a child's conception of gender cliches. O'Neill's deployment of physical and spatial distortion and the very intentional reduction of a photorealistic or classical exactitude, albeit underpinned by the odd realist detail, such as the mirrored floor and some handsome colour work, this style is burned into the very fibre of the story itself. Consider Fear and Loathing Marshal Law as told in the hyper-realist style of Alex Ross or Brian Hitch, and you can see how important O'Neill's less refined energy is here. It probably wouldn't work at all in any other register. In a strange manner, the slightly runaway quality that the physique work embodies also seems to reach backwards too. There are hints of the alternative comics and artists of the previous decade, and though stylistically on the surface at least they initially appear distinct from each other in this faux classical tableau of a god going to seed, there is a resemblance to a slightly more orderly Ralph Steadman-esque take on the 1950s heroic ideal. There are hints of the alternative comics and artists of the previous decade. Spiritually, almost certainly this is the case. Steadman appears much more the inspiration here, certainly more apparent than, say, Kurt Swan or Wayne Boring, the American artists of the 1950s, and this feels like an important point. One feels that the roots of this story lie within that distinctly countercultural, satirical framework. One can also assume that the choice of title itself, Fear and Loathing, is far from accidental too. Ghosts of Steadman and Thompson seem embedded within the DNA of the imagery itself. All the more apparent, of course, when one recalls that this was the 1980s when the American president's wife, Nancy Reagan, was insisting that we all just said no. Shown here tying off one of his comically powerful veined muscular arms and surrounded by discarded drug paraphernalia, we see Colonel Buck Kane shooting up heroin. O'Neill's abrasive sensibility renders the character as a comically warped figure, his legs and frame almost too large for his small head. The hands seem at once powerful and pathetic at the same time, and it's clear that the comic book superhero body is being satirised as much as the political idea that underpins it. The design execution is vital to the meaning itself. O'Neill's parodies of the heroic form perfectly complement the sense of separation that Mills details in his narrative. These are humans distorted beyond rationality, godlike monsters which have evolved into a state which demands they be kept away from the lower orders of humanity. His fine lines mapping misshapen body parts quite wonderfully suggests both finesse and insanity simultaneously, intensifying this portrait of a hero's secret life. Mills's insistence on supplying a simple line of dialogue is a clear example not just of tone, but of a confidence in vision. He wisely lets the splash page do the heavy lifting here. Understatement is all that is needed, as we are encouraged to bring our own cultural baggage to the scene. This image perfectly sums up what we've been through in the previous issues, and sets us up for the forthcoming trawl through the darkest pits of a futuristic, post-heroic Americana. For as Neill's subsequent panels tumble together like a fever dream, this impression of insane authority cast in a comedically surreal situation also functions as the perfect index for impeccable American icon caught behind closed doors, literally with his trousers down. A corrupt superhuman dragged to earth by secrecy, addiction, and, ironically, weakness. A total lack of control, the truth behind the ideal. Back in 1991, this narrative blew me away completely upon first reading. The startling imagery alone told me back then that superheroes as we knew them were done. Like all nostalgic concepts, they were great fun, great to acknowledge as part of growing up, and to be occasionally returned to as a reassurance within an increasingly complex world. But O'Neill and Mills told us pretty starkly that you can never go back. Nothing could be the same from now on. Seeing Superman shooting up in a lavatory wasn't just a throwaway hustler-style comic image. It was the whole story about our jaundiced, cynical view of a Reaganite America right there and then. So this was undoubtedly British satire at its very best. So if you love someone, smile and then give them the first issues of Marshal Law, and then wait for the screams. It still retains its subversive appeal, and it still feels just as radical as it did back when. You might feel you want to wash your hands after reading it though, but you know that's alright, and I'm sure that Uncle Pat and Uncle Kevin will thank you for the effort.
I would say it's just in our nature. I don't think there's anything sort of let's calculatedly shock our audience. It's just there's no one to rein us in, and what are we really obsessed with, so we just get darker and stronger, and all the better for that process.